The hall in Addis Ababa was heavy with silence before a single voice shattered it. Mahmud Aliyu, the brand new chair of the African Union, rose from his seat and slammed his fist on the table. Reparations are not charity, he thundered. They are the return of stolen wealth. In that instant, Africa and the Caribbean were no longer whispering about injustice, they were demanding justice in front of the world. Barely 3 months into his role, Yu has become a roaring lion from Djibouti, carrying the fearless energy many had only associated with Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. His words echoed across the Nelson Mandela Hall, calling for not just apologies for slavery and colonial plunder, but for real reparatory justice, wealth returned, structures dismantled, dignity restored. And in doing so, he placed himself squarely in the line of fire, staring down the very powers that once drew false borders, shrank Africa on the map, and drained its lifeblood. The timing could not be more symbolic. For the first time in history, leaders of Africa and the Caribbean gathered face-to-face under the roof of the AU headquarters, uniting continents that were once torn apart by chains and ships. In the air hung both grief and hope, grief for ancestors sold and silenced, hope for descendants determined to stand tall and unbowed. But here's the question, brothers and sisters, is Yu the Pan-African liberator we have been waiting for, the Sankara reborn? Or is he just another bold talker whose fire will be smothered by the old guard of elites and global powers? History warns us to stay cautious. Yet the energy in Addis Ababa hints that something larger may be awakening. This is not just another summit. It is a turning point, or a test. And we must ask ourselves, will we let this flame die, or will we fan it into the fire of a new era of freedom? If you believe reparations are about justice, not charity, share this message. And subscribe if you know that the truth of Africa's story is worth more than headlines. The Second Africa-Caribbean Summit in Addis Ababa was meant to be ceremonial, a gesture of solidarity, a few warm words, a reaffirmation of shared ancestry. But what unfolded that Sunday morning was far more seismic. It became a thunderclap that reverberated from the Horn of Africa to the Caribbean islands, shaking the very foundations of how Africa presents itself to the world. Mahmud Aliyu, the new chairperson of the African Union, had been in office for less than 3 months. Yet from the moment he walked into the Nelson Mandela Hall, there was a sense that something was about to break from tradition. Tall, firm, and unsmiling Yu stood at the podium and immediately set a tone of urgency. His opening lines were not about diplomatic niceties, but about wounds that had never been healed. He did not ask politely, he demanded. Former colonial powers, he declared, must acknowledge their crimes, apologize openly, and move beyond empty words to tangible reparations. His speech rejected the old language of development aid and instead reframed the debate. Reparations were not a gift, but the rightful return of stolen resources. His words hit hard. The plunder of Africa and her diaspora funded the wealth of empires. To speak of justice without reparations is to mock our ancestors and betray our descendants. Then came the moment that crystallized the summit in the minds of millions watching online. Yu lifted a map and held it up to the audience. It was the familiar Mercator projection, the world map most school children have seen. He pointed at the small, shrunken outline of Africa. This is a colonial lie, he said, his voice rising. Africa is not small. It is larger than the United States, China, and Europe combined. For generations, we have been taught to see ourselves as less when in truth we are vast. The hall erupted in applause, with leaders from Jamaica, Ghana, and Barbados nodding vigorously. For the youth streaming the event across Lagos, Accra, Kingston, and Port of Spain, that image became an instant symbol, flooding social media with hashtags like "D True Size of Africa" and "G Justice Now." The summit was historic not only for Yu's defiance, but also because of who was in the room. For the first time, heads of state from Africa and CARICOM met in person on African soil. The Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis sat alongside the President of Angola. The Secretary-General of CARICOM, Carla Barnett, spoke of a homecoming, reminding everyone that the Atlantic Ocean, once a highway of chains, was now a bridge of reunion. "We are not merely building partnerships," she said. "We are reaffirming family." Even the United Nations, often accused of neutrality in matters of colonial legacy, sent its special representative Parfait Onanga Anyanga to deliver a message on behalf of Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. The UN statement admitted plainly that Africa and the Caribbean had been victims of two colossal compounded injustices, the slave trade and colonial domination, during the creation of the modern world order. While cautious in tone, it was nonetheless an acknowledgement that the demand for reparatory justice could no longer be dismissed as fringe or radical. As speeches continued, what became clear was the convergence of memory and future. Leaders invoked the genocide against the Herero people in Namibia, the Mau Mau torture camps in Kenya, the debt imposed on Haiti after independence, and the betrayal of the Windrush generation in Britain. These were not abstract grievances. They were historical scars still bleeding into present-day poverty, displacement, and exploitation. And yet the conversation did not remain trapped in the past. You and other leaders pushed forward-looking solutions, using reparations to fund African and Caribbean universities, modernize hospitals, and power green energy revolutions. They spoke of blacklisting corporations that exploit child labor in cobalt mines, and of building transcontinental air and trade routes that bypass Europe entirely. By the time Yu concluded his speech with the words, "From Addis Ababa, we renew our covenant to honor our ancestors, uplift our descendants, and reclaim our destiny in freedom and unity," the hall was on its feet. Some were clapping, some were wiping tears, others simply sat in stunned silence. It was not the ordinary end of a summit statement. It was the planting of a flag, a bold line drawn across centuries of injustice with Africa and the Caribbean, declaring they would no longer beg but demand. For ordinary people watching from afar, from street vendors in Accra to students in Bridgetown, this was more than politics. It was vindication. For once, leaders were not mincing words, not apologizing for their anger, not softening their demands to appease Washington, Paris, or London. For once, they were speaking as if Africa's destiny truly belonged to Africa and her diaspora. The tension in the Nelson Mandela Hall reached its peak when Mahmud Ali leaned forward, his hand striking the polished wood of the AU desk with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. Delegates shifted in their seats, startled not just by the noise, but by the raw defiance that accompanied it. Reparations, Yu thundered, his voice carrying across the chamber, are not a plea for charity. They are the rightful return of wealth stolen from Africa and her children. In that single moment, what had begun as a summit of ceremonial speeches turned into a confrontation with history. The atmosphere transformed less like a diplomatic meeting, more like a trial where centuries of empire were finally being called to account. The reaction in the room was electric. Leaders from the Caribbean, many of whose nations still carry the crushing weight of colonial legacies, erupted in applause. The Prime Minister of Barbados stood up, hands clasped high above her head, while the delegation from Jamaica nodded fiercely. Carla Barnett, Secretary General of CARICOM, was seen wiping a tear as she whispered, "It has been too long." For them, Yu's words struck at the heart of ongoing struggles: Haiti's independence debt to France, Britain's betrayal of the Windrush generation, the unresolved pain of slavery and displacement. Across Africa, the echoes were just as powerful. Delegates from the Democratic Republic of Congo whispered about foreign companies bleeding their cobalt mines dry while children toiled underground. Representatives from Zimbabwe invoked the memory of stolen farmland and ongoing land disputes. A Namibian minister reminded the audience of the Herero genocide carried out under German colonial rule. And a Kenyan voice rose to recall the Mau Mau fighters tortured in British camps. Each of these testimonies piled onto Yu's declaration like fuel, feeding a wildfire. But the most striking reaction did not come from speeches. It came from the people outside those marble walls. Within hours, Yu's words and his dramatic map demonstration had gone viral. On the streets of Lagos, students gathered with giant true-size maps of Africa, chanting that their continent was no longer to be belittled. In Nairobi's tech hubs, young programmers began sharing online tools comparing Africa's vastness to Europe and North America. In Accra, street vendors debated what reparations could mean: free healthcare scholarships, roads built with Africa's own wealth. Across the ocean in Kingston and Port of Spain, reggae musicians freestyled lyrics about justice long delayed but now demanded. Social media became a battlefield of emotion. Hashtags like "Ya Justice Now, Senachen Reparations," "Not Charity," and "Naksha True Size of Africa" trended simultaneously across Africa and the Caribbean. Memes of Yu slamming his fist circulated alongside old photos of leaders like Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, and Kwame Nkrumah, drawing a direct line between their interrupted visions and Yu's boldness. For millions of young Africans and Caribbeans, the summit was not just politics, it was a resurrection of hope. The international response, however, was mixed. The United Nations, through its envoy, Parfait Onanga Anyanga, read Antonio Guterres' message acknowledging the compounded injustices of slavery and colonialism. The statement was cautious but groundbreaking. It was rare for a UN Secretary-General to use such blunt words. Yet diplomats from Europe remained silent, their faces frozen as the cameras rolled. Behind closed doors, whispers suggested that Western governments were uneasy about how far the reparations movement might go. If Africa and CARICOM united their demands, the financial and political consequences could be staggering. Meanwhile, in Washington, analysts on think tank panels warned that used rhetoric could fuel anti-Western populism. On television, pundits speculated whether the African Union might move to blacklist corporations accused of child labor in mining or even convene tribunals for colonial atrocities. The old guard in Western capitals knew that if words became action, their historical immunity could crumble. And yet, amid the celebration, skepticism lingered. Older Africans who had seen charismatic leaders rise and fall whispered reminders of the past. "We had Nkrumah, we had Sankara, we had Lumumba," one elderly Ghanaian said on the radio. "Their dreams were silenced. Will you be any different?" It was a sobering echo, a reminder that passion alone does not guarantee survival in the treacherous world of global politics. Still, in that hall in Addis Ababa, the moment felt undeniable. You had taken what was supposed to be a carefully managed summit and detonated it into a spectacle of resistance. For the first time in decades, Africa and her diaspora were speaking with one voice, not asking, not begging, but demanding. Whether that demand would be met, ignored, or crushed remained uncertain, but for millions, the emotional high of that day was unforgettable. The summit's climax was not only Yu's defiant speech, but the collective roar it unleashed from ministers, from street corners, from social media feeds. A roar that said the time for silence has passed. The world must answer. When the applause finally died down in Addis Ababa, the true weight of Mahmud Ali Yu's words began to ripple outward. Beyond the symbolic fireworks of the summit, civil and political consequences started to take shape, some inspiring, others unsettling. For ordinary Africans especially, the youth Yu's defiance felt like a breath of fresh air. University students in Dakar painted murals of Africa stretched to its true size, emblazoned with the words, "We are vast. We are worthy." In Ouagadougou, young people compared Yu to Captain Ibrahim Traore, declaring that a new generation of leaders was rising leaders, unafraid of the old order. Talk shows in Lagos buzzed with debates on how reparations money could be used, funding local startups, paying teachers properly, ending hospital shortages. In markets, street vendors shook their heads in amazement, saying they had never heard AU leaders speak so directly without the usual careful language designed to please Western ears. But with hope came unease. The old guard political elites in several African capitals who still depend on Western aid, military ties, and personal fortunes tied to foreign contracts were not pleased. Rumors spread quickly that some governments were already lobbying behind the scenes to tone down the AU's position before it could harden into policy. As one Kenyan journalist put it, "You has lit a fire, but many of our leaders are holding buckets of water ready to put it out." In the Caribbean, the reaction was deeply emotional. In Barbados and Jamaica, Yu's words were described as a homecoming. Radio programs replayed his fist-on-the-table moment over and over. In Haiti, activists linked his demand for reparations to their centuries-long struggle to be freed from the illegitimate debt imposed by France. For them, Yu's voice was not just African, it was their voice too. Across the islands, rallies were held where people sang old freedom songs, now infused with a new hope that Africa had not forgotten them. Politically, the summit marked a turning point. The AU and CARICOM issued a joint declaration framing reparatory justice as a shared and non-negotiable demand. Analysts warned this could create new blocs within international negotiations. For example, African and Caribbean representatives at the United Nations might begin voting as a unified bloc pressing for changes to the Security Council or financial institutions. In practical terms, this could shift global debates from climate change compensation to trade agreements, putting former colonial powers under increasing pressure. Yet the risks were real. Western diplomats privately worried that the reparations demand could sour investment deals or trigger punitive measures. If multinational corporations feared lawsuits or blacklisting, they might pull out of African markets, leaving fragile economies exposed. Some leaders quietly cautioned against moving too fast. Others warned of coups, pointing to the tragic history of leaders like Lumumba and Sankara, who paid dearly for their boldness. Within Africa itself, Yu's speech revived difficult questions about sovereignty. Could the AU, long criticized as bureaucratic and toothless, actually take steps as bold as blacklisting corporations? Would national governments allow such enforcement, or would they sabotage the effort to protect their own ties with foreign backers? In this sense, Yu's call was more than a demand for reparations, it was a challenge to the political courage of his peers. Among the people, however, a new sense of pride was unmistakable. In Accra, a mother told her children, "You see, we are not small. The world has lied to us for too long." In Kingston, a young poet recited, "The chains were never broken, but today we rattle them louder." Across continents, civil society groups began organizing campaigns to push their governments to follow through. The summit's aftershock revealed the dual reality of Yu's bombshell. On one hand, it ignited a wave of empowerment, giving ordinary people language to demand dignity. On the other, it exposed the fragile loyalties of leaders caught between history's call and present-day dependencies. In the end, the civil and political consequences of Yu's words may depend less on what was said in Addis Ababa and more on what Africa and the Caribbean do next. From Washington to Brussels, Yu's thunderous call for reparations did not go unnoticed. In the United States, the official response was muted, almost carefully scripted. The State Department issued a bland statement praising Africa-Caribbean cooperation without directly addressing the explosive demand for reparatory justice. Yet behind closed doors, analysts on Capitol Hill worried that Yu's words could spill into American politics. After all, the debate over reparations for slavery is not foreign to the U.S., it lives on in congressional hearings, academic studies, and community activism. For African Americans, Yu's declaration felt like a mirror held up to America itself. Social media in Atlanta, Detroit, and Harlem lit up with clips of the AU speech, with many calling it the voice we've been waiting for. In Europe, the discomfort was palpable. France, still haunted by its colonial history in West Africa and its contested debt collection from Haiti, faced immediate pressure from activists. Britain was reminded of the Windrush scandal and Germany of the Herero genocide in Namibia. European newspapers framed Yu as radical, but many readers wrote in letters and comments acknowledging that history's debts cannot be erased by silence. At the United Nations, Secretary-General Antonio Guterres' earlier admission that Africa and the Caribbean suffered two colossal compounded injustices was now amplified. The summit placed the UN itself under scrutiny. Would it move beyond statements and actually support mechanisms for reparations? Diplomats whispered that a resolution might soon be tabled, but no one was sure how far it could go without sparking global backlash. Beyond the West, however, Yu's speech found resonance. In Latin America, leaders in Cuba and Venezuela praised it as part of a wider global South uprising. India and Brazil, nations with their own histories of colonial exploitation, expressed cautious solidarity. China and Russia seized on the moment to highlight Western hypocrisy, framing themselves as partners in Africa's new sovereignty drive, even if their motives were strategic rather than moral. The larger question now circles across world capitals: can this demand be contained? If Africa and the Caribbean truly form a united front pressing not just for apologies, but for structural change, the balance of global negotiations could shift. Climate talks, trade deals, debt relief, all could be reframed through the lens of reparatory justice. For Washington and Europe, this is no longer a symbolic debate. It is a geopolitical fault line. The echoes of Addis Ababa still hang in the air. Mahmud Yu's words were more than a speech. They were a strike of lightning across centuries of silence. For a moment, Africa and the Caribbean stood taller, unashamed to demand what was rightfully theirs. Reparations were no longer an abstract idea. They became a living call for justice, a reminder that history's debts remain unpaid. And yet history warns us to be vigilant. We have seen charismatic voices rise before Nkrumah, Lumumba, Sankara, only to be silenced by bullets, coups, or betrayal from within. The old guard of global power does not surrender easily. Washington and Brussels may smile politely in public while working to fracture unity in private. Even within Africa and the Caribbean, elites who profit from the current system may attempt to smother this fire before it spreads. But this moment is too important to ignore. Reparations are not about money alone. They are about dignity, restored futures reclaimed, and systems rebuilt on fairness rather than exploitation. If Yu's bombshell is to become more than a headline, it will require relentless pressure not just from leaders in grand halls, but from ordinary citizens in Accra, Kingston, Lagos, and Port-au-Prince. So, brothers and sisters, the question comes back to us, will this be remembered as a turning point or as another dream deferred? Will Mahmud Ali Yu's roar awaken a generation, or will it fade into silence? Please share this message if you believe reparations are about justice, not charity. Subscribe if you want Africa news that digs deeper than the headlines. And tell us in the comments, do you think Yu is the Sankara of our time or just another bold talker?